BBOR, Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Friday, another Cooper Friday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Fridays, I talk to you guys about D.B. Cooper, the man responsible for the only unsolved skyjacking in U.S. aviation history. And in this episode, I will be looking at Jack Coffelt as a D.B. Cooper suspect, responding to comments about last week's episode on Better Dead Than Poor, and of course, continuing with the discussions on the Skyjacker, which examines the psychological profiling of hijackers. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about D.B. Cooper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. And many of you guys will know that there are other shows on Black Box Online Radio. One of them is about the Zodiac Killer that comes out on Monday. So I would like to let you know that today's episode is partially sponsored by Michael Cole, a friend of the show and author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy. If the Zodiac case fascinates you, be sure to check out the Zodiac Revisited. It's a deep dive into the mystery, with a unique and interesting perspective. The trilogy is available on Amazon, Spotify, wherever you get your favorite true crime books. And if you enjoy the series, please consider helping out Michael by leaving a 5-star review. And as for D.B. Cooper, the motivation for this episode is very simple. I did a Cooper Friday recently that was on Pop Sugar's list of 14 D.B. Cooper suspects. And perhaps the first one that was on their list was Bryant Kofeld, who went by the name Jack. And Jack Coffelt was one that I took a glance at because he is a widely discussed D.B. Cooper suspect. But during the Pop Sugar episode, they listed his birth year as 1916. And I simply, talked about him for a little bit. But I said, if he were born in 1916, the D.B. Cooper skyjacking occurred in 1971. That would make him 66 years old. I don't even want to entertain anything else about this guy as a D.B. Cooper suspect. I thought that was too old. But I suddenly realized, as soon as I had put the episode together, that I don't know any math. I mean, I knew that, but I realized that I made a mathematical error because I always try to count these things out on my own. I mean, if you're not good at something, the only way you can improve is by trying, right? But I'm not going to try anymore, being very honest. I'm just going to use the calculator for everything. If he were born in 1916 and the skyjacking was in 1971, that would have made him 55 years old because, I think you guys can understand. So in all fairness, I would like to do a standalone episode on Jack Coffelt as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And we're going to see that there are some strong points in favor of him being D.B. Cooper, the man who skyjacked the Boeing 727 going from Portland to Seattle back in November of 1971. And there are also going to be a lot of criticisms. In fact, I think people who are in the vortex are very much opposed to Jack Coffelt as a D.B. Cooper suspect, and let's find out why. Firstly, the basic information that has been provided by WikiTree. Jack Coffelt was born on February 20th of 1916 in Jasper County, Missouri. So, if he was born on February 20th and the skyjacking occurred on November 24th, then he would be 55. And I think I actually said in the Pop Sugar episode that he was 66 years old, but his birthday would have happened not quite yet. So he would have been 55 years old. Once again, I apologize for that. And Jack Coffelt died on June 19th, 1975, at the age of 59. So he didn't even make it to 65 years old, but he passed away in Honolulu, Hawaii. Now let's go through the basic biographical information. As far as this goes, he was named Bryant after his mother's maiden name, but he was known by many as Jack. He was married twice, and his last wife is believed to be living. Jack claimed to be D.B. Cooper, and he tried to sell his story but was unsuccessful. In 1971, a man called himself D.B. Cooper, and he hijacked a Northwest Airlines flight and demanded $200,000 in parachutes before making his escape. And already, I don't even need to say it, but I'll say it anyway. He called himself Dan Cooper, and the media ended up labeling him as DB Cooper. He said that he was injured from the jump and that the bag containing the money had been blown away. He even took a friend to the site where he said he had landed and burned the parachute. His claim was reviewed by the FBI, but ultimately they determined that the story was false, even though the stewardess Florence Shafter and another passenger named Georges Le Bissonnière positively identified him from photos. His very detailed account has some still believing that he was the infamous hijacker, D.B. Cooper. Florence and another stewardess, Tina Mucklow, confirmed many of the strange details he told a friend, and fellow Atlanta Penitentiary inmate James Brown, even though these details were not part of the official record. And as far as the physical appearance of Jack Coffelt goes, I actually think that he looks like a combination of the D.B. Cooper sketches put together. He looks like a little bit like Composite A, a little bit like Composite B and Composite C. If you were to take them all and electronically combine them, I think you would end up with somebody who looked like Jack Coffelt. Now, as far as looking like each individual sketch, I don't really see much of a resemblance. And I've interviewed Eric Eulis for Cooper Friday, and he has a suspect named Vince Peterson. I should say that he had a suspect named Vince Peterson, and ultimately he backed down from him, but he said something about Vince Peterson, and that was that he doesn't want to speak ill of the dead, but he was not an attractive man. And I would say the same thing about Jack Coffelt, because again, I'm not the best at rating people's appearances, but he doesn't stand out to me as someone whom the flight attendants, Tina and Flo, would call an attractive man. That was something that they really wanted to reinforce and reiterate, is that D.B. Cooper was not very attractive in their eyes. But if you were to just do some basic Googling about Jack Coffelt as a D.B. Cooper suspect, you would find that he had a history of being a con man. That's one of the first things that come out, so you always have to be somewhat skeptical of his stories. Some other information that is posted about him is that he claims that he landed near Mount Hood in Oregon, which is due east of the Mount Hood National Forest. And this would be a very substantial distance from the other expected drop zones. We're talking about something like 50 miles. So it's not as extreme as Walter Recca claiming that he was 100 miles from the flight path, but maybe 50 miles not only to the east but also southeast of the expected drop zones, which would have been in southern Washington. And to those of you who have followed Cooper Friday, you will know that I'm mostly a supporter of the claims that D.B. Cooper landed in Washington state, not in Oregon, purely based on the timing, and someplace like Battleground in Washington would be a little bit more of an accurate drop zone, in my opinion, but if you want to dispute that, you can put your ideas in the comment section down below. But some of the reasons why people think that Jack Coffelt could have been D.B. Cooper is in relation to his stories. He claimed that he was in Portland before the hijacking. Shortly after the hijacking, he had injuries to his legs, which he claimed he got from a rough landing after he had jumped out of the plane. And the second thing is, he claimed that he lost the ransom money. So is this just some guy who doesn't have an explanation about where the money is, but he claimed he lost it in the jump? He brought people to look at the jump site, and he also was trying to show them the thing that would have happened, where he would have landed. If somebody's going to go to that length, to go to those efforts, is there any credibility to their story? And you might be wondering, of course, there's going to be stuff posted online on WikiTree and PopSugar. What about the case file? What about the documents? Well, I have to give credit to Ryan Burns and norjack.org for posting a giant PDF of Jack Coffelt documents, and I did not know what I was getting into with this suspect profile episode. That thing had more than 100 pages of documents put together, and you can get it online for free. It's a PDF that you can view, but most of it has been redacted. And I was just reading through. I'm trying my best. Some pages are like 85% covered in redactions, so we don't actually know the full text, but it appears that Jack Coffelt had some type of meeting, friendship, and conversations with a Boeing executive. Could somebody have been behind the skyjacking with him? or at the very least provided him with information? Could he not have obtained the information about the Boeing 727 from somebody else, or was this part of an intricate plan where they were going to split the money? These things are questions. But the strongest points that are in favor of Jack Coffelt being D.B. Cooper, in my opinion, is he was actually looked into by the FBI. And it appears that some people think very highly of his story. They actually verified that he was in Portland shortly before the skyjacking, November 24th, 1971, and he also had real injuries to his legs after the skyjacking would have taken place. So it doesn't appear that he's completely making everything up. But what do you think about this claim that he's trying to sell his story as a movie about being D.B. Cooper? Is he being fraudulent? Because what if the real D.B. Cooper were arrested 2 days later? How on earth could he get away with that? I'm going to come back to that one, and I would really love to know your response. But I told you guys that Jack Coffelt is one of the most heavily criticized suspects in the vortex, if you will. And I have to give another shout out to Martin Andrade, who has really done a lot of excellent commentary on the suspects. And you're going to see that this is one that's going to be a little bit harsh. Jack Coffelt, a con man who spent most of his life in prison. Kofeld claimed he was Cooper in 1972. Apparently, the goal was to make a movie and get money out of a movie deal. Kofeld himself died in 1975. The FBI interviewed him, but his story was wrong on several important details, which they never released. Regardless of the details of Kofeld's story, we do know that some things were completely wrong. He claimed to have landed near Mount Hood, which was far too south and far too west, and he also claimed that he had an accomplice, and that even though they landed very far from Victor 23 and that corridor, they somehow met up and were able to make their escape. Story is being sold to the public by one of Kofeld's former cellmates. And, if people have actually heard his story and he walked them through it, they might believe it. But we have to remember that he was a con man. I mean, the thing about the drop zone, I think what Andrade is saying is that that is so much more important than what Mr. So-and-so claims happened. He's looking at a certain implausible aspect of the Jack Coffelt story. But this stuff about he told people that he was D.B. Cooper and his ex-cellmate is claiming that, well, think about the con man angle of this. And if you do read through those case file documents, then you will see some of this other stuff. Jack Coffelt spent a very large portion of his career working as a used furniture salesman. All of this stuff is in the documents. And he was hired because he was a smooth talker and he was, persuasive. So this ties in very neatly with being a con man. That's just an escalation from being a smooth talking used furniture salesman. He would also disappear from the furniture sales job from time to time, claiming that he was going out to the Midwest taking medical courses, and his boss would hire him back, but the boss didn't even necessarily believe that he was actually taking medical courses. There certainly wasn't any evidence to corroborate that, but as previously stated, he was a convincing salesman. And I think somebody like that would really let things get to his head, because people who think that they're just this amazing, convincing salesman, and I'm talking about the mind of Jack Coffelt, mind you, people who think that they're this amazing, convincing salesman, and they're just a brilliant con man, and they're just so good at telling stories, and they can pull the wool over people's eyes, they can fool anybody. No, they can't. Absolutely not. No, they're not. They're not good at it. They're just only isolating the people who fall for it. They just use those tactics on hundreds, if not thousands of people. Some people say yes, and some people say no. A lot of it's probability. Yes, of course, some people are going along with the act. Yeah, of course, you're able to persuade like 10% of the population to buy your junk or listen to your crappy story, but the majority of people can see right through this stuff. And I think a lot of you guys who are listening to this right now probably recognize that it seems like Jack Coffelt is somewhat of a con man. Although, even though the stuff about the drop zone is far off, even though it seems like he has a pattern of lying and telling wild stories about being in Portland before the skyjacking, injuring his legs after the skyjacking, that is something that I would consider. And it also seems like perhaps he may have just wanted to tell his story. He may have wanted to just get a movie made about him because he actually thought he had a real and genuine story to tell. A lot of people do that. I mean, a lot of people think that their biography would make for a good movie, even if it's something that is mostly made up and fabricated. I don't doubt that Jack Coffelt was a real con man. I don't doubt that he told a bunch of lies, and yet he thought that it would make for an interesting movie, and that might be one of the most benign things about all of this. But there is another article that is written about Jack Coffelt on page6.com, and it's called Abe Lincoln, Link to Hijacker. You guys know I can't resist something like that. And it says, a new book claims to have solved one of the last great mysteries of the 20th century, the identity of D.B. Cooper, the notorious hijacker who parachuted from a Boeing 727 in 1971 with $200,000 in cash and vanished without a trace. And in an odd twist, the culprit has ties to the family of Abraham Lincoln. In the book, The Last Lincolns, The Rise and Fall of a Great American Family, Charles Lackman, an executive producer of Inside Edition and former Post reporter, says that D.B. Cooper was really Jack Coffelt, the chauffeur of Abe Lincoln's great-grandson, Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. And it does state in the documents, too, that he also worked as a chauffeur for another substantial portion of his career. Lackman claims that Kofeld was a boozing ex-con who charmed his way into Beckwith's life in a bid to get his hands on the Lincoln fortune, seeing him as a perfect mark, rich widower, childless, infirm with Parkinson's disease, and none too swift. But when that didn't happen, Kofeld's desperation over his failure to assume control of the Lincoln Trust Fund may have been driven to turn hijacker. So that's the motivation for the D.B. Cooper skyjacking of Jack Coffelt is your suspect. He couldn't get his hands on the Lincoln fortune, so, he's like, you know what, I'm going to jump out of a plane with $200,000, which he lost, mind you. The book traces the deserved checkered lives of Lincoln's descendants, a dysfunctional family, and some were alcoholics, eccentrics, and spoiled brats. The book reveals that Kofelt was in Portland on the same day that Cooper boarded the plane, and was later seen sporting leg injuries from what could have been a rough parachute landing. Kofelt also made statements to a family friend that he was D.B. Cooper. Jack Coffelt died in 1975 at the age of 59. One more time, this is from page6.com. I think it's really interesting that I just happened to come across this article shortly after I was talking about the theory on Ripper Wednesday about how Abraham Lincoln was actually killed by Jack the Ripper, and that's the subject of another book. And to be very clear, let's be very clear, not killed by Jack the Ripper. Abraham Lincoln was killed because of a conspiracy, and one of the conspirators was named Francis Tumblety, who is also a Jack the Ripper suspect, and of course somebody has found a way to link it all together. Well, Abraham Lincoln was sought for death by Jack the Ripper, and his great-grandson was being driven around by D.B. Cooper. Isn't it just amazing how the world comes together? But I think you guys can tell that I'm always skeptical of these con men stories, and I'm also not impressed by any of them, because I'm a regular listener to the program Crime Talk, and one thing that I heard this morning on that show is that how do criminals find their victims? A lot of the time they're going after the person whom they expect will not fight back. And this doesn't mean physical fighting. This means verbal altercations, not making noise, people who will allow them to go along with their criminal activities. And that's all I'm really seeing from somebody like Jack Coffelt. It just comes down to the exploiting of vulnerabilities, and that's all it is. And it seems like Jack Coffelt did that a lot, because in the files that I was talking about in that PDF that you can read online, somebody was even saying, oh, no, he's not a bad guy. Oh, but by the way, did you know that he has direct personal ties to J. Edgar Hoover? So it seemed like no matter what Jack Coffelt was doing, he was also just telling wild stories. He was always telling wild stories. It was part of his personality. And there are different types of liars in the world. There can be the types that are pathological, that actually do this because it's almost like a disease or a condition where no matter what situation they are in, they just can't stop lying. Then there are liars who do things more in a type of agreeable way, where they just want to maintain the balance and avoid conflict. These are the compulsive liars. There also can be chronic or habitual liars who just tell lies frequently to their own benefit. Sometimes they're malicious, sometimes they're not, sometimes they're trying to blow a story out of proportion, other times they are just saying things out of habit. It's a habitual lie because it's more comfortable for them to tell some wild story that would make people feel good as opposed to actually telling them the truth. And then there are the sociopathic liars, and these are the ones that spin webs of lies to manipulate and to deceive. And believe it or not, I'm actually thinking that Jack Coffelt was closer to a sociopathic liar. And I say this because what if he actually made the whole D.B. Cooper story up, and then he brings two people to the Pacific Northwest to show them where he was jumping out of the plane, where he landed, as well as talking all about how he is still trying to find the money could still be out there. If he were to actually lie about all of that, I would call that a sociopathic lie. It does not mean that someone is a clinical sociopath. It's just spinning webs of lies for their own benefit, to deceive and manipulate people because it is practical to them. And even if it's not really practical, it's fueling their own excitement. And a very clear example of a sociopathic liar in the true crime world is Casey Anthony. I was talking to you guys about the show The Deception Detective on the Tuesday program, and the Deception Detective said that even though he's a lawyer who's trained in statement analysis, Casey Anthony is a liar, but she was actually very good at thinking up lies on the spot. With somebody like Jack Coffelt, I think that his actions surrounding the lies that he told, if they are indeed lies, I mean, maybe he was D.B. Cooper, right? But if he was lying, then it would be more or less just about taking advantage of people who wouldn't put up much of a fight. I definitely think it's the former thing that I was talking about, exploiting vulnerabilities other than being some type of brilliant con man. But I told you guys that I would get to some things about last week's episode, and that was when I was discussing the book Better Dead Than Poor by Lisa Story, which looked at Walter Recca as a D.B. Cooper suspect. And Lisa Story made a post on Facebook where she thought that I had miscategorized some of her statements, and it appears that post has been taken down. So, firstly, I would like to apologize if I did indeed misrepresent anything from the early sections of her book, and I'd also like to make up for it by telling you guys that there is the book Better Dead Than Poor, and a very brief blurb is, was my uncle a government hitman or the infamous skyjacker D.B. Cooper? That's a mystery I needed to unravel after a family trip took a sharp turn. Walter Recca, my uncle, tossed a file on the table and said, I did that. Inside was a yellowed newspaper and a clipping about an assassination attempt on a Middle Eastern terrorist. As I dug deeper, I uncovered a shadowy past, criminal exploits, covert ops, and ties to private paramilitary companies, and you can read more about that in the book Better Dead Than Poor by Lisa Story. And I also want to point out something that you guys who follow the D.B. Cooper case know that there are reportedly 900 confessions from people who have claimed to have been D.B. Cooper. 900 confessions. Two of them would be Jack Coffelt, who has already confessed to multiple people that he was D.B. Cooper. He tried to sell the rights to the D.B. Cooper movie, for goodness sake. And Walter Recca would be another one of them. And a lot of these suspects that I've mentioned on Cooper Friday have also confessed to have been D.B. Cooper at some point, and I have a suspect playlist which I invite you to check out, as well as, just watching some of the other D.B. Cooper content. I have 2 episodes about the DNA, and I'm really planning on doing some more technical things in the future that are going to be analyzing the hard evidence. And you could even watch the 14 D.B. Cooper suspects from Pop Sugar, even though there's a terrible error at the beginning when I misstated that Jack Coffelt was 66 years old, is what I believe I said in that recording, and I do apologize for that once again. And the reason why I wanted to make this episode this is getting back on Jack Coffelt, is because Jack Coffelt would have actually been younger than Milton Vordahl at the time of the skyjacking. If Cofelt's 55 and then Milton Vordahl is 58, Kofeld's a younger suspect, so he is not too old to have been D.B. Cooper, and I apologize for saying that on a previous recording. But more importantly, I mean, if you're going to say that it's possible for someone in their mid-50s to have committed this, then Jack Coffelt fits that. There are some strong points, but his entire checkered past should not be ruled out. And on these episodes of Cooper Friday, I often conclude the episodes with a segment called the Cooper Profile, where I talk about the writings of Dr. David G. Hubbard. And this is something that I am also working on for a larger D.B. Cooper presentation on the psychology of skyjackers. Dr. David G. Hubbard was really the first person who tried to profile skyjackers from a psychological perspective because these crimes started in the mid-20th century. And as I was reading my latest chapter in The Skyjacker, it was the story of a man named Ted, and part of me really thought that it was going to go straight for Ted B. Braden, but no, this is just a different guy named Ted who ended up being a skyjacker. Ted Braden, of course, had his own illustrious career. However, this Ted is not mentioned by his last name. All of the case studies in this book only refer to someone as their first name or a nickname. And Ted was someone who grew up with a very different experience than a lot of the skyjackers that I've talked about for the Cooper Profile segment. Most of them were not the oldest and they were not the youngest in the family. They were from very large families, and maybe they were the second oldest or the second youngest, but they were from somewhere in the middle of the birth order. Ted is an exception to that. He was the oldest, and he only had one other sibling. He had a younger sister, but, he was the oldest, and that just goes to show you that these types of psychological observations might reveal patterns and trends and similarities, but it is not a purely predictive set of patterns and trends and similarities. You might be able to say more often than not, okay, the skyjacker is the second person born among the children in a family. Well, with the case of Ted, he is an exception to that pattern. He deviates from that pattern. But another thing that has been very frequently discussed on this Cooper Profile segment is skyjackers very frequently have a father who was abusive and or an alcoholic, and a mother who was extremely religious. And Ted meets that one exactly. His father actually started out as somewhat of a reasonable and successful businessman, but then drinking took over his life, and his mother, who was extremely religious, encouraged the father to start working and volunteering with the church, and he became more involved with the church. But that doesn't seem like it really shaped anything in Ted's personality and core beliefs. Now, Ted is someone who is also different from the other skyjackers that have been discussed. He had an exceptionally sharp memory, and he stated that he was even able to remember learning how to walk. He remembered the first time that he was able to crawl onto a chair. Very specific things from being a baby. And this is almost even deviating from the world of skyjacking and D.B. Cooper. But I would love to know what you guys think about this as an unrelated challenge question. Do you believe those types of stories? I was once told that you were unable to remember your second birthday, but I swore to someone that I did because, my mother was actually in the hospital that time, and I remember being in the hospital. I remember what type of shirt she was wearing. I can even see it in my mind right now. And my little sister, who is 2 years younger than me, was also in one of those nursery rooms, and I can remember seeing her in that nursery room. Like, I can remember those things. But someone said it's impossible to remember your second birthday. Your memory starts after you turn 2 years old. And this is not just, somebody. This was a psychology professor, mind you. And I think that a very easy way to reconcile all of that is when you have these types of vivid memories from when you were a kid, like how Ted is talking about, he can remember learning how to walk. He can remember the first time he sat in a chair. It's a combination of what adults told you. It's a combination of the second or third time that you've done something. I mean, maybe what I was doing is I can remember what shirt my mother was wearing on my second birthday. Well, maybe that was a different hospital visit, and I just stitched them together in my mind. Maybe I was just able to think about something else, or maybe somebody told me about something that influenced my memory. So the same thing could be true of somebody like Ted. But do you believe those stories about how people can remember things from either before their second birthday and earlier? But Ted grows up as someone who's actually a fairly good student until the 5th grade, when he realizes that he doesn't like the repetitious nature of school. He doesn't like doing these repetitions in his daily lessons. Oh, we learned about this last year. I don't need to do this. So his academic performance really trails off. And during his first years of school, like first grade, second grade, third grade, all the way to fifth grade, he was very passionate about art. He was a very good artist, but then people told him that artists are sissies, and that stayed with him all the way until adulthood. So from the fifth grade, he's a poor student, and he stops trying in school. He gives up on art as a passion, and by the age of 16, he ends up joining the military. He drops out of high school in the ninth grade, and he joins the army at age 16. He becomes engaged to a woman, but while he's in the army, she leaves him for another man because he's not around. I mean, no fault of at Ted for that. That's on the woman. She leaves him for another man. So he's very devastated about that. When he gets out of the army, he tries to get right back into the military again. And at age 18, he's in the National Guard. But after 4 months in the National Guard, he goes AWOL. And then he is ultimately meeting up with another criminal. They get in trouble, and he ends up getting sent to jail. When he gets out of jail, he learns how to fly an airplane. All right, so you're seeing something with skyjackers, criminal past, connections to aviation. He learned how to fly a small airplane, a light aircraft, at the age of 21, and he's going to go on to become a skyjacker later on in the future. What does this say about somebody like D.B. Cooper? D.B. Cooper knew very specific things about the Boeing 727. I mean, he knew where the oxygen tanks were. He knew about the flaps and the landing gear. He knew about the pressurization of the cabin. D.B. Cooper knew a lot about airplanes. Maybe D.B. Cooper was Jack Coffelt, and he conspired with a businessman from Boeing to do the whole skyjacking, or maybe it was somebody else altogether. You tell me. And then, with this guy Ted, so he learns how to fly an airplane. And then ultimately life is actually starting to get better. He gets married, he has 2 children, and he's working different types of jobs, moving to different types of states, but he gets in trouble with the law again. He's actually working for a transportation company, and his cousin robs the company office. But they begin to suspect that it was an inside job. And in the book, The Skyjacker, there's a direct quotation from Ted. I didn't do it. I didn't plan it. I didn't execute it. They just thought that I was involved because my cousin did it. So he gets sent to jail again. And then this is the start, really, of the brewing factors that would lead him to becoming a skyjacker. He feels very bad because he was wrongfully imprisoned. And when he's in jail, he's reading the news about what's going on in... Oh, wait. I'm sure you can guess where. Where is he reading the news from? Cuba. D.B. Cooper's almost like a very different type of case because so many of these skyjackers are trying to go to Cuba. And you guys who have followed the D.B. Cooper case in the world of aviation know that Cuba was the top destination for skyjackers. I've talked about a lot of them in this Cooper profile segment. And D.B. Cooper's trying to, well, not D.B. Cooper, this guy's just named Ted. Ted wants to go to Cuba, but not necessarily as a skyjacker. He actually gets this idea in prison that the United States of America has wrongfully imprisoned me. I'm done with this country. I'm going to take my whole family to Cuba. So he goes to the Cuban embassy in Mexico, and he says, hey, can I immigrate to Cuba? Can I defect from the United States and bring my family to Cuba? And they say yes. They just say yes. He gets approved to be a Cuban resident, and he brings his family to Mexico, and they visit the embassy, and they're on board with it. And I'm just sitting back and thinking, whoa, now wait a second. If you ask me to move to Cuba, am I going to be on board with it? I'm going to be very honest with you. If somebody in my life, in my family, just asked me to move to Cuba with them, I would not say yes. I would not say no. I would say, what are you talking about? Cuba? Like I would genuinely be confused. And I'm going to explain some things in a second. So his family's going back to the United States of America, but in reality, his wife was using this as an opportunity to leave him. It seems like she's just going along with his plan to move to Cuba so easily. She wants to get out of that marriage and just be done with this type of criminal shenanigans, as well as just always on the go and always on the move, because mostly he's trying to move to Cuba legally, but he wants to just head on out to Cuba and start, something new over there. So, because he was in prison previously for the robbery, he was out on parole at the time, and by going to Mexico, he violated the parole, and his wife is using this as an opportunity to get rid of him. The police are looking for him. So what's the plan? Commit a skyjacking. And the plane that he is actually skyjacking is going to El Paso first, because to all of the people who think that D.B. Cooper wanted to go to Mexico, this is your time to shine. He is aware of the refueling stops, that the plane that he is skyjacking probably can't fly to Cuba because of the lack of fuel. So he would need an intermediary location to stop the plane, and then he finds one that's going to El Paso, Texas. But ultimately, the skyjacking falls apart, and bear in mind, this guy Ted brought his 16-year-old son with him, and I'll come back to that later, actually. So they skyjack the plane, they land in El Paso, and ultimately it's thwarted. Ted is apprehended and accosted, and he's unable to go to Cuba. Then, when he's being interrogated, some information comes out. His son says that they weren't trying to go to Cuba to become residents. They were actually trying to fly to Cuba to sell the stolen airplane. And once again, this guy Ted is like, what? No, absolutely not. Why would he say that? And have you noticed a pattern with Ted's behaviors? And I know patterns aren't a perfect science, but I really began to think that this guy is another habitual liar, another sociopathic liar, another extremely deceptive liar, a liar on par with Jack Coffelt. He's saying, no, I had nothing to do with the robbery. I don't know why they think I had something to do with that. What? No, I wasn't going to steal the airplane and try and sell that. It's just always the explanations in his life are just about something that's really ridiculous. Yeah, my wife totally wanted to move to Cuba. I'm shocked that she would turn on me like that. All of these explanations are just somebody else's fault. It's always just somebody else's fault. He's just blaming other people, and he's trying to commit crimes and then just play dumb at the end. And he probably thinks that he's a good liar, but with somebody like Jack Coffelt, with somebody like Mr. Ted from The Skyjacker, I think that they would both go into the category of they think that they're master manipulators and master persuaders, but they probably don't fool too many people. Jack Coffelt was probably a superior liar in terms of his ability to persuade people compared to this guy Ted, where he's just like, what? No, I didn't do that. Wait, me? Who, me? What? No. You're probably thinking of Ted B. Braden. Phew, what a guy. He's the kind of person that would steal a plane and go to Cuba. Firstly, perhaps. But this guy Ted ultimately got busted and sent to jail. But once he was in jail, he discovered his love of painting once again, much like our good friend Paul Sini. Turns out these skyjackers aren't bad at everything. But I would love to know what you think about the story of Ted, and also about how the psychological patterns aren't purely predictive, or they're not going to be the same with every single skyjacker. And I did know that going into this book, that not every single person is going to have the same childhood, the same types of experiences. It seems like some of them are present, but it also seems like the genuine elements, and I'm not talking about the lies, but the genuine elements that are driving this guy Ted to commit the skyjacking are financial trouble, frustration with his life. And another detail that I left out was he felt extremely disappointed in his children after he got out of jail for the robbery, which he claimed was orchestrated by his cousin, because their personalities changed over the years that he was in prison. And I'm going off of memory. I think he did 33 months in prison, so just short of 3 years. But even in that time, the personalities of his children changed. Problems with money, problems with his family, problems with life. And there also seems to be something that's happening with these skyjackers who are in their 30s and 40s, maybe 50s if your suspect is Jack Coffelt, where they just realize that they've made a lot of mistakes in their life. They want to be rich, they want to be powerful, they want glory, they want the money. Yet, a lot of their life choices didn't lead them to that point. So what's the plan? What's the follow-up? Commit a crime in which they can obtain the money. Why not rob a bank? Why not a jewelry store heist? What do we always come back to? Because they were familiar with airplanes, because they were familiar with aviation, and they thought that they could get away with it by skyjacking an airplane. Cooper demanded $200,000 and 4 parachutes. Way better than trying to sell a stolen airplane in Cuba. And that's how this guy Ted deflects it. He's like, I could never sell a stolen airplane in Cuba. It belongs to the airline. It's clearly not my plane. No one would ever buy this thing. Now, I mean, I kind of agree with that, but based on the pattern of Ted's behavior, and patterns aren't perfect, but on the pattern of his behavior, it seems like his son was telling the truth and he was lying. But what do you think? In on this segment, the Cooper Profile, I mostly talk to you guys about the book The Skyjacker. I've been going through one chapter every week. But David G. Hubbard was also the author of the book Winning Back the Sky. And I would just like to share one thing that was in this book. It's actually, just from the description, because this is one that I'm hoping to look at in the future. Dr. David G. Hubbard was the first to penetrate the mind of the skyjacker, and he played an important role in shaping the airline and government policies which brought skyjacking under control in the 70s. Now in this book, he turns his attention to the psychological and political factors which have brought about the renewed threat of our safety in the skies. Winning Back the Sky takes the reader into the experience of the terrorist, his victims and targets. Dr. Hubbard explains how the history of terrorism and of skyjacking have intersected, how the cultural background of religions such as Islam makes skyjacking powerfully attractive to militants. And with somebody like D.B. Cooper, would you think that there was a religious motive involved? I think absolutely not. I mean, D.B. Cooper may have been raised as a Christian, but I think that this would actually be something that's going to be quite different, because I fully admit that people can commit these types of crimes in the name of terrorism, but some people think that D.B. Cooper was a terrorist and he's working for such and such entity. I'm not really seeing that. Everything that I'm seeing indicates that D.B. Cooper was working by himself. And David Hubbard also says how the public is paralyzed by its own distorted perception of the terrorist and his crime. I absolutely think that the public is distorted with the perception of D.B. Cooper, because, I even started thinking about him as a harmless guy, because I talk about serial killers mostly on this channel, the Zodiac Killer and Jack the Ripper mostly, but I talk about other serial killers too in the shorts that come out Monday through Friday. One more time, you can hit the like button and subscribe if you want to follow along with all of these true crime discussions, and they really are more vicious than D.B. Cooper, but Cooper was not a good person. As Dr. Todd Grande said in his psychological profile, he was the type of person that was going to threaten to kill dozens of people if he didn't get money and parachutes. Cooper was not a good person. The analysis alone is not enough. Winning Back the Sky offers tough-minded and practical advice on combating terrorism and individuals as a nation. Dr. Hubbard contends that if we understand the dynamics of terrorist thinking, we can effectively control the impact of our society. So, when it came to the skyjacking cases that we've mostly been talking about, they're usually individuals, lone wolves, who are doing this because of frustration. They were doing this because of the problems with security, because of the holes in the security system. You know that, and I know that. For example, D.B. Cooper is able to get on the plane with an alias, Mr. Dan Cooper. D.B. Cooper had a bomb in his briefcase, or what appeared to have been a bomb. D.B. Cooper did not have to go through any metal detectors. All of these things. Holes in the security system. And that might not thwart some giant terrorist observation, but it definitely should reduce people like Cooper from operating in the 20th century. Not 100%, it won't eradicate it 100%, but a lot of it will be reduced. I would love to know what you guys think about this episode. What do you think about Jack Coffelt as a D.B. Cooper suspect? Are you more in line with somebody like me that thinks that he's just a lying con man? Or do you think that there's a high chance that he could have been D.B. Cooper? What do you think about Walter Recca as a D.B. Cooper suspect? What do you think about the confessions to people who have been D.B. Cooper? And what do you think about the story of Ted? And now, my biggest takeaways is just that this is a guy who is very deviant, who is very thoughtful, gets lost in his own wild trains of thought, and he just launches bizarre schemes that only make sense to him, and in short, he just tells lies along the way to make everything work for himself. And ultimately, the skyjacking just happened to be one of those scams. He wanted money, he wanted glory. He wanted to do something that made himself feel good. But that's just it. They're coping mechanisms to financial stress and frustrations with life. Most of the stories that I've talked to you guys about on the Cooper Profile have been people who are dealing with frustrations and financial stress. These are coping mechanisms that people are using. And if anything, I think that D.B. Cooper would have had a lot of that in mind. What do you think? Let me know your ideas. Put them in the comments section down below. You know where to write the show, blackboxonlineradio@AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is Ned DeHaan. There's also a Black Box Online Radio Facebook page, which I'm hoping to use more in the future. And the images that you see for this show going by on the screen are archived at True Crime Designs on Facebook, as well as blackboxonlineradio88 on Instagram, another great place to watch shorts and reels. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxned88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help the show. And anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. That's all for me now. You guys have a wonderful weekend, and until next time.